Morning. The psalm for today is Psalm 50, first few verses. The Lord, even the most mighty God, has spoken and called the world from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof. Out of Zion God appears in perfect beauty. Our God shall come and shall not keep silent. There shall go before him a consuming fire, and a mighty tempest shall be stirred all around him. He shall call the heaven from above, and the earth that he may judge his people. Gather my saints together to me, those that have made a covenant with me with sacrifice. And the heavens shall declare his righteousness, for God is judge himself. Hear, O my people, when I will speak. I myself will testify against you, O Israel, for I am God, even your God, the word of the Lord. So today we want to talk about one of the sweeping changes that helped to bring the modern world, the world in which we live today. And that's the change called the Industrial Revolution. As I lecture, this is a reminder, you should be taking handwritten notes. Studies have shown, and you can find this on our syllabi discussion, that there's something about slowing your brain down, forces you not just to copy every word that I say. I mean, you could probably just listen to the lecture again if you wanted to do that, but to sort of begin to process and figure out what of the facts and the analysis is actually really central. I'm giving you way too much information because I'm trying to help you contextualize what you're hearing, and I'm giving you hooks to hang the information on. Different people might be inspired by different things. It might be a song, it might be a painting, it might be a book, it might be a history reference. So not every fact in here will be useful for you, but you need to figure out how you're going to organize and remember the information. And writing things down helps. So today, as we work through the Industrial Revolution content, I want to kind of help you answer a couple of interlocking questions. One is to kind of ask this question, why? Why does the Industrial Revolution happen? It's such a sweeping change. I want you to kind of be able to talk about the cultural factors that lead to the Industrial Revolution, as well as the scientific and technological factors that lead to it. You should have a sense of the sweeping social change that emerges from the Industrial Revolution. This lecture will help you to understand Darwin, Marx, and Charles Dickens as we begin to work through some of those arguments. Even though the Industrial Revolution is begins as an Anglo-American phenomenon, it's rapidly copied by the rest of the world. I mean, there's some sense in which China and India in the last 20 years have really kind of internalized the changes triggered by the Industrial Revolution and have become themselves industrial titans. So if I, for instance, if I hadn't been born in Vermont, but if I'd been born in Afghanistan, I would very much be trying to process this change and how in the world would this come to Afghanistan, and would this be good or bad? So that sort of speaks to this other kind of, this is fundamental for world history, not simply because it brings modern social values, but because it seemed to really affect the world in different ways. The scholars call this the Great Divergence. So the understanding of how the West and the rest of the world kind of became less like one another is an important part of the story. And each of those things are sort of interlocking pieces of how industrialism affects our course. So I'm gonna move my picture around a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about how industrialism, what the world looked like before industrialism. Now, industrialism, what we call the Industrial Revolution itself, is the concentration of goods making activity in what we might call a factory, right? There's a second industrial revolution that really comes after 1870, and we would connect that to mechanization, right? So assembly lines, robotics, machine time motion studies, those are all a product of the second industrial revolution, when they begin to kind of bring machine things together, when they begin to assemble production together in one place in factories in the mid 18th century, it doesn't mean they're working on kind of machines that are that much more complicated than what they would do at home. So a way to think about this is to think about kind of sewing, right? If you have a sewing machine in your home today, you're doing a kind of industry, but it's kind of pre-industrial revolution. You're doing things at home. Your work is dispersed in a local community. You sew when you feel like it. And all you need is the money to buy a sewing machine and you can move forward. And you can be at far different levels of skill. In the modern world, we don't have kind of regulations about this. But in the medieval world, if you worked in these different, I have a sewing example that we're talking about, but the pictures that you see here are of a grist mill from colonial America that made flour in a place not unlike Hope. You've got a river, there's a bit of a waterfall. The water power drives the turning of these wheels. It grinds things into flour. And the regulation on that would have been done by the local community. Or like if you were making shoes in 17th century Amsterdam, which is the bottom picture, right? Here you see the cobbler, man and wife, working together in their home, but the price that they could charge for shoes and the quality of the shoes and the process by which the shoes made would have been regulated by a guild of master cobblers. And so even though you could work at your own pace and make as many as you liked, the process would be heavily regulated. Now, I want you to think for a bit about how the Industrial Revolution might trigger a whole kind of series of social values so that the modern society that we live in would be quite unlike, say, pre-industrial society. And the book, I'm not making you read it, but the book that I've read that's most helpful for me in thinking about this is a piece by Professor Patricia Crone, and it's called Pre-Industrial Societies. And she argues that to understand what life was like before 1800, you have to think about life before the Industrial Revolution. It's first of all highly stratified. You have an elite. And she's describing societies all over the world, whether you're talking about medieval Japan, or whether you're talking about chiefdoms in sub-Saharan Africa, or whether you're talking about Aztec society, or whether you're talking about Russian kind of merchant republics like Novgorod, or whether you're talking about Scotland in the age of Macbeth. They're all highly stratified societies. The vast majority of people, in most cases, 95 to 98% are peasants and have a high level of kind of unfreedom. There are a few kind of aristocrats who control the land, and there is generally a military caste. And then you have town dwellers who kind of distribute goods and services, but only in unusual societies, like say England before this might have been 10% upper and middle class. Japan approaches 10%. Holland might actually be 20% in, say, the 1700s. And that makes it a highly unusual place. Most of the world, like in Russia, you might see 98 or 99% of the people as serfs. And industrialism is going to radically change that and change it so dramatically that for the next century and a half, people are going to be struggling to figure out, well, what does this mean? How do we come to terms with it? So what is the center of social life before the Industrial Revolution? It's not the city. It's not your job. It's going to be your family, and it's largely going to be your place of worship. That's going to be where you take your values. And this is all done at an incredibly local level. So what we've been talking about for 2 semesters as Western culture, going back to the Greeks, was for most people a kind of veneer, right? So you might have some kind of a story that organized your life, but it's probably not going to be Plato's Republic or Dante's description of purgatory. It's going to be folk tales and fairy tales and legends that you grew up on. Most people don't even speak the national language of the place that they're associated with, right? It's only as you see this wave of nationalism emerging in the modern period that people begin to really kind of adopt local national languages. Like even in England today, England is sort of really striking for the degree to which dialect. You can go to England today and figure out someone's social class and where they're from by listening to them carefully. It's much harder in America. But they did a census in Italy in 1861 Italy didn't even exist yet, right? And it turned out that only 2.5% of people that today we would call Italians even spoke Italian as a language, which would be the people who lived in the space around Florence. So what we call Tuscan, the language that Machiavelli and Dante wrote in, that's the language of modern Italy. Most people don't speak it. Even in a comparably centralized nation like France after the French Revolution, a quarter of the people living in France still don't speak French. They speak Provençal, or they speak Breton, or they speak different languages kind of associated with people. So many people are still kind of oriented around their place, and it's only it's only this process that sort of creates modern culture. And it's hard for us to think about anything otherwise because our culture is so shaped by what we watch on YouTube and by Netflix and by the things that we consume from media. But you remember, radio doesn't really even emerge until the 1930s in most places. So for most people, the spoken word is going to be in a local patois or a local dialect. One of the things about this pre-modern way of doing economics is that adolescence doesn't really exist within this space, right? So if someone's 14, they're no longer really a child. They're working in this highly stratified economic system. They're probably, if they're lucky, they're an apprentice, apprenticed to a grist mill or apprenticed to a cobbler, with the possibility of someday in your 20s becoming a journeyman. A journeyman is defined by someone who owns your own tools. And if you demonstrate your facility with it, then you could become a master cobbler or a master craftsman. And then you're sort of employing other people in your facility, right? But when you become a master craftsman, a master cobbler, say you have a half a dozen apprentices, you're really successful. You own the tools that the apprentices use, and they generally live inside your home, and you're responsible for them in the same way that a father is responsible for their children. That's sort of it, that's the sense of it. So an apprentice isn't fully an adult. They're a legal dependent. But it's different than what the factory system, right? The master was assumed to be morally responsible for the people working in their factory. They were a moral community. And one of the things that happens when you move to industrialism is it's deeply disruptive of that. Think about what this means then. Teenagers are sort of not children, but they're not adults. They fall into this category of unfree labor, like serfs or like even slaves. And so they're not fully in control of their lives. They're not expected to marry for love or to fall deeply in love with the right person and go off and start a family together. In this world, marriages are economic. They might be arranged around craft alliances or family alliances or dynastic ties. There's no real youth culture. The people who are valuable in these kinds of societies are the elderly. So you're venerating the old rather than the young. It's romanticism, which we're going to talk about soon, that sort of begins to venerate the young. So all of the character models that you have when you're trying to figure out who you are inherited. They come to us from the past, and they come from morality and tradition and religion and maybe the classics. So this is a world that's going to treat something like privacy for young people as a total unmitigated disaster. I mean, all kinds of really bad things can happen to carefully laid plans if people are given privacy. Privacy as a creation is kind of an idea of a modern world, which you might, and a few people might experience it. Aristocrats might get privacy. People living in cities might get privacy, but generally not. You're sort of living in a neighborhood dominated by a particular craft, right? And the values, the economy of this society is going to be less about money, more about honor, shame, in a way that pre-modern societies operate, in ways that kind of stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey are working. Okay? Now, so that's what society looked like before the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk a little bit about where industrialism happens and kind of why. And why is this especially socially significant for our course? You see industrialism first in two industries, in metallurgy and in textiles, right? And the centers of textile production in Europe, now in the medieval era, had been in Italy, but by the 16 and 1700s, it has shifted north to this area around Flanders, and to this area here in East Anglia, where many of the Puritans came from, right? So those are kind of proto-industrial centers in Europe. And in metallurgy, you kind of need two things to kind of make it work. You need to be able to assemble iron ore. Iron's very heavy to transport. And I think the thing to understand about early modern Europe is transportation is terrifically expensive. If you're on water, it's not too bad. But to move anything a ton more than 20 or 30 miles is generally going to be worth more than the thing itself, right? So transportation costs of 20 or 30 cents per ton mile overland are not uncommon at all. To put something on a cart and transport it is really, really expensive. So the river network of Europe becomes really valuable as something that other parts of the world necessarily don't have. I mean, China has this, but say like the eastern shore of North America doesn't have this kind of river network like the Rhine and the Danube that go far in. So Europe is primed for that kind of, the transportation makes it easier to move the iron to a place where there's also coal, which you're going to need to heat up the iron to the phase where you're going to melt it and make it into steel. So these are the two kind of proto industries, and they're really significant because they drive other industries, as we'll talk a little bit about. The industry, yeah, so let me talk a little bit about where Europe is kind of demographically. The population in the late 18th century is rapidly increasing. Part of this is sort of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, but Europe in 1750 has 187 million people in it. So this means that it's the most densely populated continent on the planet, and the population is rapidly accelerating. It's primarily, this density is primarily concentrated in the northwest of Europe, in England, in the Netherlands, and Belgium, and in northeast France, although to some extent you see some of it in Italy. But Italy and Germany had actually been heavily depopulated by the wars of early modern Europe, and not just religious wars, but the dynastic struggles that Machiavelli is writing about. And so there's actually, we think about the Enlightenment as an era of optimism, but actually when people began to think about demography, there was deep fear connected to the future. And this fear is best expressed in a book that Thomas Malthus wrote in 1797 called An Essay on the General Principle of Population. Malthus is a figure that we'll come back to when we talk about Darwin, and so Malthus is particularly important for kind of understanding intellectual life in Europe. And Malthus was deeply pessimistic about population increase. There's a sort of, we could talk about why population is increasing. There's a sense in which medicine is beginning to develop in a modern direction. In the late 18th century, you're seeing the kind of, they're discovering blood cells for the first time. They're discovering factors that lead to blood coagulation for the first time. There are advances in midwifery that make it possible for childbirth not to be quite so dangerous for women. They're developing a smallpox vaccination. They're shifting to cleaner urban water. The rats are sort of being driven out of cities, and you're seeing decreases in the bubonic plague. So this is, you'd think this would be a wonderful time to be alive. Malthus is actually really worried about this because he sees that as populations increase, it's very difficult for farming to increase in a way that can meet the demands of the population. So this is, I mean, it's sort of an economic theory. You see it in this graph here, right? So if, he says populations increase exponentially, and you've seen exponential curves this summer when you talk about how rapidly COVID cases sort of increase. So populations multiply as they grow, but our capacity to kind of grow food increases not exponentially, but arithmetically. So you hit this point, shown here on the graph as T, which is called the Malthusian trap. Past that point, the excess population will be kind of as mouths to feed. And this is how people understood sort of what was happening in the 19th century in that infamous Irish potato famine, right? So you see, there are these sort of checks on the population of Ireland in the yeah, in the 14th century, there's Black Death that brings it down. There's war, there's famine. You see this spectacular population increase in the 1800 to 1840, followed by the potato famine, and it crashes the population back. And this is a horrible humanitarian tragedy. But lots of people living at that time would have seen it as this sort of inevitable thing. It couldn't be stopped. So there's this really kind of dark, um, we are so overwhelmed by limitation. There's not much that could be done about it, right? And Malthus's book was largely seen as defending the social order. You really can't do that much for the poor. There can be only so much improvement in the working classes, and just sort of throw a lot of energy at the working classes is a waste of time and energy, right? Now, this is in fact not what happens. Like Malthus is living before the kind of the understanding of what the Industrial Revolution unleashes. And what in fact happens is that there's an industrial revolution in farming. And so because of technology and because of science, the capacity of a field to feed enough people to kind of meet the needs of the increasing population also increases exponentially. So Malthus he's wrong. But this is the way that people sort of understood the changes that were taking place. And so this is you sort of see these different social responses to industrialism. Should we be excited about it, or should we kind of be horrified by what's happening? Okay, now back to that actual exponential increase. The scholars would say that this is where the causes of the Industrial Revolution really lie. And you see these changes in England before you see them anywhere else. Like, so this is a famous painting by, I think it's Gainsborough. And you see this English country gentleman and in his fields with his farm, with his wife, with his dog. And you don't think about this as sort of being the heart of the Industrial Revolution, but England really had a unique set of circumstances that made it possible for the Industrial Revolution to emerge there as opposed to other places. If you go back to the map, I mean, England does have these concentrations of iron and coal, but then, okay, so does northern Spain, so does the Ruhr Valley in Germany, and so does the space in what's today Poland and Silesia. Like, why does the Industrial Revolution happen in England and not Poland? Well, there are two ways of answering this. One is to talk about technical accomplishments and to kind of emphasize the Enlightenment dream, how science created the Industrial Revolution. As a historian, especially as a legal historian, I've always been enchanted by a different answer, which is that it really has as much to do with culture as it does to do with science. So let me kind of walk that answer out for you, and then we'll walk out the science answer. Okay, so one of the things is to say that the English social system had actually generated a set of farming ownership that was less hierarchical than most of the rest of Europe, right? But about a quarter of the land in England had been consolidated into larger farms that were owned by gentlemen farmers like this man here. And the farms were not necessarily owned by the Duke of York or aristocrats who were oriented around honor as the point of their life. These yeoman farmers, I mean, they vote, they're members, they have the ability to be members of parliament, but they're primarily driven not by title, but by the ability to produce this food as a means of revenue. And they're not renting the land out to serfs necessarily to do the work. Serfdom is dried up in England after the plague. They're using their land to maximize production because that's going to make them more wealthy, right? And this increased food supply then makes it possible for people to move to London or to move to Manchester or Lancaster and participate as factory workers. The excess food makes production possible. As farm yields rise, that means that there are actually few independent family farms left. And so many of the people who would have been subsistence farmers working on this land in the Middle Ages are out of work and need to go somewhere to live. And so they get pushed toward the urban areas like London in pursuit of work, And generally speaking, they're really poor and their life expectancy is fairly awful. So I think it's the period we kind of talk about the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. And Blake has this famous line in his poem Jerusalem about the dark satanic mills. But I actually think the period before the Industrial Revolution is darker in some ways, because that's when you see the extremes of poverty. It's the period of the American and French Revolution where things are at the worst, right? Um, you also see sort of striking institutions in England where people who have accumulated this capital in agriculture have the capacity to do something with it, right? And so England has a really weak monarchy. And in the 1700s, the Bank of England um, kind of loans money to the British Crown for its wars, and the British Crown pays really high interest. And so all of the money that elsewhere all over Europe is sort of sitting in private strong boxes in old castles. In England, these small farmers are sort of incentivized to put their money in the Bank of England and to draw interest on it from the government. And because the king is fairly weak and the country is actually run by parliament, by these other members of parliament, like this gentleman here, or aristocrats in the House of Lords, there's a sense in which the king's not just going to default on his loans. And so this bank is actually reliable. Okay, now that kind of the existence of money in the bank then creates this preconditions for industrialism. And what do you need to create factories? I mean, you need wealth, but to create a factory is really a more expensive enterprising than any one kind of rich young farmer can do. But if there's a bank that's willing to loan money at credit, right, then you could be an industrialist and you could take out a £3 million loan from a bank that would expect interest. And the thing is that these government bonds didn't really make all that much money. It was safe, but you make a couple percent interest. But these new loans would create opportunities for a financial class of entrepreneurs, right? So there's something about the English credit system. Now, this is something that America shares. So America has access to this industrial revolution, but part of the challenge is that in America, industrial development's against the law until specifically after the American Revolution. And so America has no industry before 1776, and then rapidly begins to industrialize. It's got to catch up. When we talked about the rule of law means that there are independent courts and judges and laws that mean that contracts will be enforced, right? And so you have confidence in England that if you sign a contract with another merchant, that they're going to deliver you, 400 tons of coal in a week, and they don't, you're going to be able to take them to court and get your money. Whereas in another country, that might not be possible because of social restrictions, or maybe that other person is sort of connected to a rich baron or connected to the monarchy. The law's going to be enforced. There's some arguments that are made about kind of more than just the legal culture, right? The Methodist Wesleyan revivals in England, but then also in Prussia and Germany, where there had been sort of the Moravian revivals, lead to a particular kind of culture among the working classes, right? So English peasants, religious scholars are going to say, don't behave like French peasants, or maybe Italian peasants, or Russian peasants. And there's a sort of sobriety and willingness to work hard that's a part of the English culture. Now, this is especially true in America, in the northern states, in the places that hadn't embraced slavery. There's something about the slave culture that sort of pushes it up against the culture of the Protestant work ethic. England also develops in its urban areas a coffee house sort of newspaper culture of entrepreneurs who are interested in the latest political information. And the censorship laws in England are weaker than they are really anywhere else in the world, except maybe in Holland, right? So in England, after the Glorious Revolution, after Locke's ideas are put into place, there really is very little political censorship. Can we contrast that with what's happening under Napoleon, where Napoleon's actually still shutting down the presses in the same way that Louis XIV has? And so it's not just that you can't criticize the government, but you sort of get these exchanges of ideas that I think is crucial to creating an entrepreneurial culture. Now, the Marxists will argue that there's another crucial kind of cultural factor at work here, and that's that England has colonies, and that places like Germany and Poland and Italy don't. I'm less enchanted by this idea, but honesty forced me to kind of admit it, that England extracts a huge amount of wealth from the Caribbean, and Holland from the East Indies, and in particular, the slave colonies of the Caribbean create enormous wealth in sugar trades. And so that wealth, you might argue, in fact, the scholars in the Black Lives Matter movement today would argue that industrialism and capitalism was generated in part by this wealth coming from slavery. So you don't really get the modern industrial economy without it. I'm not entirely persuaded by that. And a lot of it has to do with kind of the Dutch example. The Dutch didn't have a large slave empire in the same way that the English and the French and the Spanish did. And yet they managed to create successful kind of industrialism in Holland. So one way to think about kind of why is England so good at this is to think about this culture. And then it's a bit depressing though, because if you think about the cultural uniqueness of England and the United States and maybe Holland, this is an argument that you'll find in a book by Walter Russell Mead called God and Gold. If the answer is that the English are unique, if there's a kind of an English exceptionalism at work, then it's a bit depressing about what it might mean for people in Egypt or in India who are seeking to industrialize today. That the cultural institutions might be difficult to adapt to other settings without, say, a rule of law tradition connected to a weak German monarch, or the revivalism or the newspaper culture. So this is a theme that we'll explore a bit over the next couple of weeks as we talk about kind of the relationship between culture and capitalism. Now, if you are an Enlightenment enthusiast, the answer that you would emphasize was that this is about science and this is about technological development. And so enthusiasts for industrialism in, say, France and Germany would say, well, yeah, we don't have the same kind of political culture that England has, but that doesn't matter because what we need to do is emulate the technical achievements of England. We'll be able to fully industrialize. So what does that look like in terms of the story of industrialism? Well, England does have a rich supply of coal and iron deposits in the Midlands of England that had been aggressively mined since the early modern period. And in the mid-17th century, the technical achievements of Newton and other members of the Royal Society were adapted by engineers to produce these machines that allowed them to rapidly exploit the natural resources that they had, right? So James Watt develops a steam engine. The first steam engines are used to kind of pump water out of the coal mines so that you can go deeper and get more coal. But it's quickly discovered that you can use those machines in places where water power isn't available. And so like a grist mill that had ground flour had been, in colonial America has to be situated at a waterfall line, right? So Rochester is actually famous for its flour mills in 19th century America, because there are those spectacular waterfalls in Rochester and they can be used to power all of its industry. Well, the steam engine actually makes it possible, if you have access to cheap coal at a coal mine, to begin to use that to power other machinery and kind of manufacture other kinds of goods. Now, about this time, they also figured out, these entrepreneurs figured out how to kind of industrialize the spinning process, the process by which kind of wool is kind of carded and then woven into thread, and that the thread is then woven. So one of the machines that does this is called the spinning jenny. I've got a picture of it. No, I don't. I thought I had a picture of it, and I don't. It kind of, if you think about the spinning bee in the colonial era, you've got one wheel which is sort of powered by foot power, and there's one person pushing this one wheel, and they're kind of working and work all the day to kind of maybe get a spool of thread. What if you could connect that to a water wheel or a steam engine and have one person controlling, and it multiplies exponentially. At first it might be 16 and then 30 and then hundreds. And this is traditionally women's work. So as factories developed, women increasingly push into these factories, and production is taken out of the home into a system where it's controlled not so much by home manufacture or by a woman who's working at her own pace, but someone who's working in a factory and is trying to maximize profits, and so it's sort of pushing you to do as much as you can. Now, connected to this development are developments in transportation that allow you to kind of take materials and sell them not just locally, but kind of in a national economic market. So in the early 1800s, an American entrepreneur named Robert Fulton discovers how to take the steam engine and put it on a boat and use it to go upstream up the Hudson River. Now in New York then, they kind of use the traditional medieval legal model, and they give the steamboat inventors a monopoly so that only they can develop it on the Hudson River. And so the steamboat, I mean, it does make trade to Albany quick, but it doesn't have this dramatic transforming impact. Well, the problem is it was a New York State sort of monopoly. And so quickly, other entrepreneurs go out to the Mississippi River, where in America, the steamboat has this enormous impact, and it helps to create this national market. So in Ohio, or in Illinois, or in Louisiana, you quickly become a part of this transportation network. And this is more than just about manufacturing, right? So it allows farmers in Ohio to sell their grain in New Orleans to farmers who are growing sugar, who are then going to send it to England. So rather than having a local subsistence market, see the creation of this national or even international economy. Within 20 years, they figured out how to attach the steam engine to a cart. The first steam engines are in England. The first coal train is in 1820, going back and forth between a mine and a factory. There's a passenger line in Manchester by 1830, and in England England in 1830 has 400 miles of rail line. By 1852, they have 6,600 miles of rail line. So there's this sort of exponential impact. And the railroad story is actually really interesting because it kind of talks about how industrialism and capitalism are linked. So it's not national governments that create these railroad lines. They're largely financed by these middle-class private investors who have their money in banks. And these railroad lines are risky but incredibly lucrative investments because they could pay off enormously, right? So these railroad lines in England eventually surpass these centuries-old international trading companies in terms of the value of their stock. The Northwestern Railway stock in England eventually surpasses the value of the East India Company, which has happened in our own lifetime in another kind of industrial revolution, right? General Electric had been this manufacturing powerhouse in America going all the way back to Thomas Edison. But when you were younger, the stock of Apple, this little kind of garage upstart PC company, quickly overwhelms this industrial power. And today, Apple is, I think, the most rich country. It's the most rich corporation in the world, and it's in fact richer than many countries. And the same sort of thing is happening with the railroads. There's also an internationalization of capitalism then, right? The British investors look abroad, and they especially look to the United States as places that are undercapitalized, where you've got not a lot of labor and a lot of land. And so the US actually, by the end of the century, has 200,000 miles of rail, particularly in the north. And as these markets spread, then it's possible for industrialization to spread, right? And you see sort of the implementation of this industrial discipline of factory time where everyone lives in a town. I grew up in a way like this, right? There was a factory, an old kind of fabric textile mill, the end of my street. And every day at noon, the whistle in the factory would go off. Now, I don't even know that there were many workers left anymore, right? But that would go off and it would tell the entire town that we're all going to take a lunch break at noon. And the bell would go off at 5. It was the closing bell. So instead of working at your own pace, the entire community sort of becomes regimented and disciplined and pushed toward this. And let's talk about what this means, this question of, is this good or is this bad? Well, labor becomes transformed by this here. So you see kind of two pictures here. One is a picture of the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts, where all of these women who would have been, as young women, producing local goods in their homes, they leave New Hampshire and they leave Vermont and they go to Lowell, Massachusetts, and they're working in mills and they're drawing a salary, and now they're working 12 to 14 hours a day. And they're kind of independent. They have a little bit of privacy. Now they live in dormitories, they're chaperoned, they're supervised, but they have an independent literary magazine that they run. They work under male discipline, but there are a few factory owners who are expected to live exemplary moral lives, and they're sort of advertised. The factories are advertised as moral places for young women to work. Um, and but wages actually begin to creep downward a bit as there's more competition. And eventually they stop bringing in farm girls and they start bringing in Irish immigrants who are quite poor, and the nature of labor kind of is continually transforming. These are people who, is this a good thing? We have to ask. And it's complex, right? See the utter transformation of Rochester, right? Rochester, sort of by the end of the 19th century, is a place of factories and smoke and water power. This is a famous kind of shoe manufacturing facility on the high falls at Rochester. Um, so this is the problem that Marx and that Dickens are trying to process. What is life like in these cities? What kind of moral obligations do we have? Well, people working in the mills, the owners are going to say, well, we're responsible for paying you. But we're now kind of in this liberal autonomous society where we're free individuals, and you agree to work for us and we agree to pay you. And we don't have any more moral obligations to one another than that. We pay you what we will and you accept it and you work. And this is a transaction. The kind of the communal moral economy of the older period sort of collapsed. So that seems like a bad thing. But economic historians point to this as a real transformation in the West. So take a look at this graph. What does this actually mean? Well, it means that the economy since about 1400 had really been in this set of stagnation, right? You see economic gains between 1300 and 1400 in response to the bubonic plague as labor becomes scarce and as workers are paid more. But then as the population recovers, and we're kind of stuck in that Malthusian trap, as population recovers, labor becomes ample, food supplies become scarce. And so you actually see the working classes, this is real wages. So this is like, what can an average worker buy with the wages that they're receiving, right? You actually see this deterioration in the life of the working class, roughly between about 1450 and 1700. Particularly connected to wars, particularly connected to, so like, this is sort of the economic theory of the early modern period, as a theory called mercantilism, right? So in order for England to become rich, in order for England to get more real wages, well, England needs to acquire colonies, and England needs to beat Spain and France in the colonial game. That wealth in the world is the zero-sum game. It can't be created, it has to be extracted from someone else. And after 1800, you see this change. It's a change that's sort of theorized in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. You can sort of see that, you could see the beginnings of this going back into about 1700. But beginning about 1800, you shift into an exponential growth frame, where you see dramatic gains in the real wages of people living in England and Wales. And this is happening as factories make it possible to produce goods more cheaply so that people can afford things that they couldn't afford before, right? So we think about this, in terms of textiles become cheaper, steel becomes cheaper, sewing machines become available, railroad transportation becomes cheaper. You can, in America, what this meant is that steaks become industrialized, right? Your average working class person in 1810 can't afford to eat very much meat. It's local, it's really expensive, it's really hard to get. Well, by 1900, workers can afford to eat meat because it's being produced in factories in Chicago. The process. So this is if you think industrialism is bad, you have to come to terms with this. The quality of life of the worker dramatically increases between 1800 and 1900. And then after 1900, you see it increase exponentially. So that things that we talk about today as poverty would be incomparable wealth for most people living before 1800, right? Part of what's been so striking about the last 40 years, like about my lifetime, is that those exponential growth trends are no longer just happening in the West, but you're seeing them happen in China and in India and in sub-Saharan Africa. And so you're seeing real increases in the quality of life there as well. Now, this isn't just connected to production. You can argue that this is also tied toward increases in modern medicine, toward political changes, toward democratization. But think about this graph when we talk about the modern world. There's something about the last 200 years that's dramatically different than what we've seen in all of human history before that. There's a seismic shift here. We need to process it. And why is it? Maybe it's the Enlightenment, maybe it's the French Revolution, maybe it's capitalism. So as England succeeds at this, you see nations around England figure out that they can adapt this quite rapidly. The principal industrial regions of Europe before 1850 are almost entirely in England and a few pockets in the United States. You see progress around Paris, you see progress in the Ruhr Valley, which had been given to Prussia after the Napoleonic Wars and had centralization and had, this is a place where there was some, what they would have called enlightened government, and there's something like a rule of law there. France is the second among the great industrial powers, right? They don't have as many advantages as England. While the French Revolution has weakened some barriers to trade and it made it possible, Napoleon's reforms make it possible to trade in France as a whole without all the local taxes and regulations, they still have very high tariffs that make it difficult for them to trade with the outside world. They don't have as much coal. Agriculture has been slower to develop. There are more family farms, and the power to the peasants in the French Revolution means I think that there's not as much push for agricultural efficiency. Banking is far more primitive, right? So Napoleon's only just creating the Bank of France, which in England has existed since 1700. The bank is really focused on loaning money to the government so that France can defeat the Germans in their wars. They're less focused on entrepreneurship. The state actually limits the number of joint stock corporations that can be created. Whereas in England and the United States, this is something that are kind of, there's a general incorporation law in a place like New York, where if you want to become a corporation today, you just file paperwork with the Secretary of State. Whereas in 18th century France, the corporations, you basically need a special privilege from the king. Forget that. In England, you might be able to get one from Parliament, but you know, when you create an entrepreneur-friendly culture, you make it easy to create a corporation. And firms in France tended to pour money back into land, which they thought was a safe investment, rather than taking more risks with, say, creating railroads. Now, the French government really wants industry, and the French government really wants railroads, but so they tend to want to encourage these things, but it's not the same thing as having a created by culture. There's some success in Paris. Paris is a different kind of place. They do well in the art and fashion kind of industries, but generally speaking, not so much. Now, Germany initially lags because Germany, especially before 1848, is still an intensely fragmented place. There are so many barriers to kind of trade. Monopolies are held in guilds by independent kind of traditionally minded cities. But there's a deep agricultural depression in the 1840s that shakes things up. The failed revolution in 1848 helps to persuade Germans that they need to have kind of a customs union that eventually encompasses 4/5 of German territory, even though Germany itself doesn't exist and begins the process of trade. The Krupp family begins a steel manufacturing facility at Essen in Eastern Germany, and Krupp then becomes one of the leading kind of munitions and artillery manufacturers in Europe. So Prussia begins successfully to emulate the German model, I mean the English model, and by 1870 you've seen the spread. And you don't see much development in Southern and Eastern Europe, especially before World War I. It's hard to raise capital. There's poor transportation. Spain doesn't have rivers that allow you to move around. Russia has this tiny middle class. Serfdom is only beginning to collapse. Russia has one railroad. The Russian language doesn't even have the word for factory or worker in it yet. And then the rest of the world kind of struggles to figure out how they're going to emulate Europe. India and China actually experience a loss of industrial capacity. In 1700, England is importing many of its textiles from India, where they've been manufactured in traditional ways. So what does the Industrial Revolution do to manufacturing in India? Suddenly it's quicker for Indians to import their factory from Manchester, especially as India is colonized by the British Empire in the 19th century. And so industrial production in India basically collapses. China had been a leading center of porcelain manufacture in 1600s. Well, Chinese industrialism collapses, right? So you see what economic historians sort of wrestle with as the great divergence. Britain, with many advantages before 1800, goes into this exponential growth early. Germany and France emulate. Italy and Spain copy slowly. Japan actually figures out how to industrialize, a stunning kind of economic miracle. In the 1850s, American warships show up in Japan and they decide, oh, wow, we have to change. This is about honor. Our honor has been shamed by the fact that the Americans are better than us. And they begin this industrialization process and it succeeds. It can be done in Asia. So Japan is a really important part of the story. But China and India stagnate. Much of the Islamic world loses relative power with the decline and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then the United States doesn't show up on this graph. We'll talk about the United States coming up soon. But the US is a strange story because it starts out behind the British, but by 1900, it's actually far surpassed the British in terms of its industrial power. And that's a puzzle where we should try and figure out why. What happens, right? This is of enormous significance for the course, right? And so this isn't an economic history course, but this creates a set of dilemmas that Marx and that Mills and that 20th century statesmen are trying to explain, right? So look at what happens to the share of global power when we begin the course in 1800. The US barely exists. Great Britain is dominant and becomes much, much more so. This is really striking, right? For a country in 1900 with maybe 2 or 3% of the world population to have 20% of the power is stunning, right? But then that seems overwhelming when you compare it to America in 1950 to have 40% of the world's economic power, right? And for India and China, you see this gradual diminution into the 1950s and 60s. But sort of think about what you make of this. It doesn't seem like Western dominance is assured because in our lifetime, in the last 20 years, you've seen China and India and rapidly increase their share as Russia collapses. And it's not that the American economy is shrinking, right? It's that its share of the global pie isn't quite as large. And so this is one of the themes we'll talk about at the end of the course, as Western powers kind of struggle to come to terms with this. All right, now, I'm not going to do a quiz on this lecture, and I'm not going to ask you to kind of read specific sources on industrialism. What I want you to be doing is I want you to be reading the little novel by Charles Dickens, right? And think about how is Dickens writing in response to this, right? What does this represent about what's happening in England, and what sort of debate do you see happening in the text of this novel about people's responsibility about industrial working conditions? And that'll be the subject of our first really kind of, I think, extensive conversation. All right, so I look forward to that. Make sure that you're reading, and we'll see you again soon.